国に対する直接軍事的脅威を行われることはもちろん
レーダーに阻まれて信号は困難を極めているようだが状況は一刻を争うことを無理と詳細に伝えろ。
今天铁中已被我们盟邦空中打倒了。
那么珍贵如果要强不这个能力呢，按他样神奇的生法呢？
中央人民政府今天胜利了。
In October of 1911, a group of nationalist revolutionaries led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen overthrew the imperial rule and proclaimed the First Republic in Chinese history. The new regime fell shortly into chaos as warlords of the former empire strove to regain power from the reformers. Under grim circumstances, in 1919, Dr. Sun founded the Kuomintang, also known as the Chinese Nationalist Party, to bring democracy to the country. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party, abbreviated CCP, was instructed by the Communist International to cooperate with the Nationalists to work toward the same end. After Sun Yat-sen's death in 1925, General Chiang Kai-shek succeeded as the leader of the Kuomintang. A campaign was launched to eradicate warlord forces and ended up as the nationalist recovery of the country. In April of 1927, however, Chiang Kai-shek's right-wing government initiated purges on his communist allies, marking the opening of the 10-year civil war in which the CCP fought for its survival. During the turmoil, Mao Zedong rose as the leading figure of the Communist Party, while General Chiang Kai-shek assumed presidency and achieved the highest military rank. The West hence dubbed him Generalissimo. Despite the Japanese invasion of Manchuria that took place in 1931, Chiang Kai-shek pursued his policy of first internal pacification, then external resistance. Yet his determination was undermined when the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937. Under domestic pressure, he formed an alliance again with the Communist Party to repel the Japanese invasion. World War II, which followed, marked the turning point which staged the future of China, and is where the story unfolds.
Among those stopping off at Malta prior to the Big Three conferences is W. Averill.
In February 1945, a historic meeting was held in Yalta, a resort city on the south coast of the Crimean Peninsula. Three major powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, convened for the purpose of discussing the post-war reorganization of the world. At the conference, President Franklin Roosevelt invited Russian Premier Joseph Stalin to join in the Pacific War against Japan. Stalin agreed. The Big Three proceeded and concurred on multiple articles regarding Europe's post-war reorganization. The convention was held in secret. No other countries were present, and the agreement of the Yalta Conference wasn't published until a year later. On August 9th, 1945, 3 days after Hiroshima was devastated by the first atomic bombing in the history of mankind, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. 1.5 million Red Army troops crossed the border and poured into Japanese-occupied Manchuria in northeast China. where they encountered little resistance. The war swiftly came to an end as Japan surrendered on August 15th. For the Soviet Union, establishing control over Manchuria had always been critical for its Far East interests. Its economic benefits, as well as its strategic location, were highly valued by the Russians, even in the days of the Tsarist regime. Manchuria had been colonized by Japan since the 1930s. Under rapid development, it had become a key area in northeast China, with advanced transportation and holding around 85% of the gross industrial output value in China when the war was over. Geographically, Manchuria lies between Mongolia and the Korean Peninsula and extends into Russian territory, acting as a crossroads in the Far East. Under the Cold War setting, in which China was regarded as being under the U.S. sphere of influence, it was evident that American and Allied forces' entry to Manchuria could put Soviet national defense into jeopardy. In contrast to Russia's concerns, President Roosevelt and his delegation at the Yalta Conference didn't seem to worry about the Pacific region. An editorial in the Saturday Evening Post later commented on the event as an ignominious surrender to Stalinist aggression in Asia and the loss of China in 1949. It argued that an invitation for the Soviets to enter the Pacific theater was totally unnecessary. However, the government had its own plan, as the State Department's white paper on China explained. The potentialities of the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria seemed large, and the price in American lives in the military campaign up the island ladder to the Japanese homeland was assuming ghastly proportions. Obviously, military necessity dictated that Russia enter the war against Japan in order to contain Japanese forces in Manchuria. Guided by such reasoning, Roosevelt's proposal thus fell right into Stalin's intentions. In his book, Professor Anthony Kubek expressed his disagreement with the delegation, describing it as a man playing poker with a mirror at his back. His opponent could see his hand before the play began. President Roosevelt was outtraded and outmaneuvered by Stalin, he concluded. In exchange for Soviet war efforts, Stalin requested to obtain southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, internationalize the port of Dalian, and recover Port Arthur. He also called for the U.S. recognition of Outer Mongolia's independence from China. With Stalin's bargain on the table, Roosevelt made a corresponding move. He requested the Soviet Union's acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the nationalist government, and that they cease aiding the Chinese Communist Party. Stalin fulfilled the promise by signing the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Alliance with the Republic of China, declaring multiple articles including each high contracting party undertakes not to conclude any alliance and not to take part in any coalition directed against the other high contracting party, extending the assurance to an international level. Years later, U.S. General Albert Wedemeyer indirectly criticized Roosevelt's oversight in his famous report on China. Soviet aims in the Far East are diametrically opposed to and jeopardize United States interests in China, in that their aims envisage progressive expansion of Soviet control and dominant influence. Realization of their aims in China would threaten U.S. strategic security. Back in China, Mao Zedong was not pleased as the Soviet attitude failed to meet his expectations. He had already gathered and sent more than 100,000 men into Manchuria 2 days after the Soviet entry into the war to assist Soviet occupation and accept Japanese surrender. It was a great mobilization and its motive was significant. Early in April, the CCP had determined that capturing Manchuria would serve as a future cornerstone for communist revolutions. Besides its economic value, Manchuria's geographical location allowed the CCP to lean on communist regimes in the USSR, Mongolia, and Northern Korea, and to avoid nationalist encirclement in the north. Led by Lin Biao, a seasoned battlefield commander in the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Northeast Democratic Allied Army marched into major cities held by the Soviets, only to be rejected entrance and forced to settle down in countryside areas. Mao Zedong realized that the chance of gaining support from the USSR was grim. He explained this dilemma in a Central Politburo meeting.
If the Soviet Union offers assistance to us, the US will do the same to Kuomintang, and a war will certainly break out. Just as the Soviets can assist communists in Bulgaria, but not in British-influenced Greece, the area outside Manchuria is America's domain. As a result, it might be better for the Chinese people if the Soviets do not aid us.
Even though internationally the USSR was not able to reach out to the CCP, it acquiesced to the presence of Lin's army in Manchuria. Some Soviet officers even opened up Japanese armories to provide weapons and ammunition. The Communist Party, however, didn't initially win over the support of the locals in Manchuria. Under Japanese rule, these people experienced neither the communist nor the nationalist government, as the former was essentially illegal and the latter was internationally recognized. The local population didn't tend to appreciate the arrival of the communist forces. Lin's army later reported back to Mao complaining,
"We have no party, no support of the people, no political power, no provisions, no funds, no medications, no clothing. Morale is being largely affected."
One division commander commented,
"We consumed everything in our path like locusts. The locals are holding grudges against us."
Things were not going well for Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek either. The swift termination of the war took him by surprise. Before he could react, the communist forces had already moved out to take over Japanese-occupied regions. It was estimated that as many as 200 villages and cities were taken from September to October alone. While his men were racing alongside the CCP to recover territories, he projected his force on Manchuria, a luxurious land where neither faction had set foot since 1931. However, the Soviet presence proved to be an obstacle. Early in August, Stalin sent out word saying, "To date, the Soviet forces have not established any contact with the Chinese communists, and that the Soviet forces have not discovered any communist guerrillas in Manchuria." But when the first group of nationalist forces landed on the southern coast of Manchuria, they were shocked to see communist troops building up defenses on the shore. Orders to withdraw were given after encountering fierce fire. Enraged by the Russian betrayal, the Generalissimo ordered his men to attack any communist force in their path. Within days, the nationalists pushed north. Lin Biao, commander of the Northeast Democratic Allied Army, requested to retreat, stating that if the situation continued to develop as such, the whole army would face a total annihilation. As the Communist Party struggled for its survival, an American came who might have altered the history. Appointed by U.S. President Harry S. Truman, General George C. Marshall arrived in late December of 1945. His mission was to invite the CCP and the Kuomintang back to the negotiating table, in the hope of forming a coalition government between the two, and eventually bringing the hostility to an end. Truman publicly explained America's intention in a Department of State bulletin.
The United States government has long subscribed to the principle that the management of internal affairs is the responsibility of the peoples of the sovereign nations. Events of this century, however, would indicate that a breach of peace anywhere in the world threatens the peace of the entire world. It is thus in the most vital interests of the United States and all the United Nations that the people of China overlook no opportunity to adjust their internal differences promptly by means of peaceful negotiation.
In reality, multiple attempts were made between the communists and the nationalists to produce a peaceful result, but none were successful. The most famous amongst all was the Chongqing negotiation, which was held 13 days after the Japanese surrender. In this historical moment, the two political rivals, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, met face-to-face for the very first time under the efforts of U.S. Ambassador Hurley. Consensus was reached on many articles after more than 6 weeks of intense debate, but some core issues around the keeping of communist military and territories could not be agreed upon. Now, as Marshall came to mollify the tension, the two sides met once again to settle disputes. A ceasefire was soon issued on January 10th, yet it permitted the government troops to move in and re-establish authority in Manchuria. Intended to resolve the problems once and for all, Chiang sent in his best men from the Chinese Expeditionary Force, the most elite, seasoned veterans equipped with American arms who had fought against Japan in the China-Burma-India theater. The U.S. Navy was tasked to provide transportation for these troops. At the same time, a series of conventions took place to discuss the possibility of government reform. Mao Zedong had long before expressed his wish for cooperation, but he also demanded changes.
The most important thing is the immediate abolition of the Kuomintang one-party dictatorship and the establishment of a democratic provisional central government. A coalition government enjoying nationwide support and including representatives of all the anti-Japanese parties and people without party affiliation. Without this prerequisite, it is impossible to make any genuine change in the Kuomintang areas, and therefore in the country as a whole.
He hoped for a democracy which would legalize his party and open opportunities to engage in governmental affairs. But the Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek believed any communist presence within his regime would be detrimental. He explained his concern.
If I took a neutralist stand and formed a coalition government with the Chinese communists, the whole country would then have become a Soviet satellite through peaceful transformation. Soviet Russia would then have succeeded in controlling China as a whole without shedding a single drop of blood.
Despite his opposition, the negotiations went smoothly to a certain extent when Mao even considered moving to a place near the capital of Nanking so that it would be easier for him to attend future conferences there as a statesman. However, an unexpected opportunity sparked a turn of events. 1 year after its introduction, contents of the Yalta Conference were published in February 1946. Since multiple items largely impaired Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity without the government's acknowledgement, anti-Soviet sentiment ran high in the country. Under pressure, Russian forces finally initiated its withdrawal in early April, which was originally scheduled to be completed by the end of 1945. Mao Zedong saw it as a valuable bargaining chip for the peace talks, if his party could manage to take possession of major cities in Manchuria. Now, as the golden chance lay ahead, Mao made his move. Hours after the Soviet retreat, communist forces marched in. Enraged, the nationalist government ordered its troops to re-establish Chinese authority by force. Major cities became the center of focus. Armies clashed to gain an advantage in the ensuing negotiations led by General Marshall. 2 months of large-scale conflict resulted in the retreat of communist troops. On June 3rd, Mao issued an order calling his men to abandon Harbin, the last major city they were holding, and adopt guerrilla warfare instead. The CCP's gamble turned out to be a disaster. While the CCP made a grave mistake that almost led to its failure in Manchuria, the nationalist corresponding move was regarded by many historians in the West as the beginning of the loss of China. On June 6th, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek made an open statement encouraging both sides to cease fire.
I'm doing this to give the Communist Party an opportunity to demonstrate in good faith their intention to carry out the agreements they had previously signed.
But no agreements were made afterwards. Instead, clashes not only resumed in Manchuria, but a full-scale war broke out throughout the country. On July 1st, the day when the armistice expired, both the Nationalist and the Communist Party released identical statements, calling their men to take self-defense measures once the other side launched preemptive strikes. Each accused the others of firing the first shot. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, U.S. President Harry Truman personally telegraphed Chiang Kai-shek to express his anxiety.
American faith in the peaceful and democratic aspirations of the Chinese people has been shaken. The selfish interests of extreme elements, both in the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, are obstructing the aspirations of the people of China.
In an endeavor to mediate the war, General Marshall placed an embargo on the export of munitions from the U.S. to China in late July, which wasn't lifted until May of 1947. But all was too late. Upon his withdrawal from the China mission, Marshall interpreted the breakdown of negotiations in a public statement. The greatest obstacle to peace has been the complete, almost overwhelming suspicion with which the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang regard each other. On the one hand, the leaders of the government are strongly opposed to a communistic form of government. On the other, the communists frankly state that they are Marxists and intend to work toward establishing a communistic form of government in China. But others believe there's more to it. Bai Jingyang, a renowned writer from Taiwan, critically commented that Marshall's failed intervention lacked binding power on the CCP. Bai points out that Marshall threatened to cut off American assistance in order to contain the nationalist government's aggressions, a trump card which essentially had no effect on the communists, who thus gained initiatives on the table. U.S. General Douglas MacArthur thought the state's policy towards China was impractical in the first place. It is just about as much chance of getting the commies and nationalists together as that oil and water will mix. Interestingly, Marshall's mission was denounced by both warring factions. In a speech in the 1960s, Chiang Kai-shek bluntly censured the U.S. attitude towards his country.
American society was deceived by the Soviet and Communist bandits' propaganda, and the pro-communist left-wing members in particular believed our party and government are corrupt and reactionary, and that we didn't deserve support. As a result, Marshall later not only abandoned our government, but also ceased American assistance and subsequently irresponsibly quit his duty of mediation.
The CCP, on the other hand, depicted Marshall's intervention as a scheme.
The U.S. government used mediation in the hostilities between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China as a cover for strengthening the U.S. forces of aggression and the reactionary Kuomintang rule in various ways. To gain time to prepare for his civil war, Chiang Kai-shek, prompted by U.S. imperialism, pretended to accept the demand of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people to stop the civil war. In July, when the disposition of his troops had been completed, Chiang Kai-shek launched a countrywide counter-revolutionary war. Subsequently, on August 10th, Marshall and Leighton Stewart, U.S. ambassador to China, issued a joint statement declaring that mediation had failed in order to give Chiang Kai-shek a free hand to wage civil war.
With both sides disapproving of Marshall's involvement, the success of the general's mission no doubt remained questionable. The Civil War raged on for 3 years when the victory finally favored the CCP over the Kuomintang. American persistence on its peace efforts continued until February 1947, when General Marshall was promoted to Secretary of State after his renunciation of his China mission, and proceeded to devise his plan for the revitalization of post-war Europe. Explanations for the communist victory vary. Chiang Kai-shek bitterly blamed American involvement in his domestic affair.
If the government troops pushed forward, communist remnants in northern Manchuria would have been liquidated and the situation throughout Manchuria stabilized. The subsequent defeat of government troops in Manchuria in the winter of 1948 was largely due to the Second Ceasefire Order.
He condemned the U.S. exertion of pressure in making peace between his government and the communist bandits, which effectively led to the downfall of his country. Taiwanese author Pai Sin-yung holds a different view. He believed that Chiang Kai-shek was overly confident in his judgment. The Generalissimo thought the CCP had no possibility of reviving after taking heavy losses, and that the government forces could easily smash the remnants of the communists if it wanted to. Chiang's decision to cease fire was more of a merciful offer, which also acted as appeasement of the American peace endeavor. Pai also argues that Marshall didn't have any power over Chiang, and abundant evidence has pointed to the fact that Chiang's determination could not be simply shaken by the American policy. Voices within the United States, however, focused mainly on America's devotion to the affairs in China. Senator Joseph McCarthy publicly accused the Department of State of treachery, and that it was being thoroughly infested with communists. He moved on to criticize the Truman administration's attitude towards communism, mocking that the measures taken were soft. General Wedemeyer also urged changes in his report on China in 1947. In order to preclude defeat by communist forces, it is necessary to give the nationalist government sufficient and prompt military assistance. In response, Secretary of State Dean Acheson dedicated a lengthy section in the State Department White Paper on China, defending the degree of U.S. involvement by pointing out that the rapid decay within the Chinese nationalist government was the primary cause of the loss of China, instead of lack of American aid. The Communist Party echoed Acheson's point regarding the corruption and economic failure in the government, which it believed was the major impulse that sparked the communist transformation throughout the country. According to official records, around 70% of governmental expenditure was spent on military during the Civil War. The government subsequently resorted to the printing of new money, which resulted in a hyperinflation. In the foreign exchange market, for example, before World War II, 3.41 Chinese yen traded for $1 US. At the end of 1945, the yen fell to 1,222 to the dollar, and by May 1949, $1 traded for 23,280,000 yen. Paper currency was worth less than scrap paper. Consequently, the communist land reform programs and other policies were favored by the suffering majority, mostly peasants who made up around 80% of the total population at the time. Many of them later willingly volunteered to defend their benefits through communism. Even a certain amount of nationalist troops converted and fought for the communist cause. Other aspects, such as Soviet aid in Manchuria, as well as military tactics, were praised as well. The war saw its end in 1949 when Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China and Chiang Kai-shek retreated to the island of Formosa, also known as Taiwan. No peace treaty was signed, and conflicts were still taking place until the end of the 1960s. Statistics of casualties vary, anywhere from approximately 8 million to 11.7 million military personnel and civilian deaths from 1927 to 1949. For the Communist Party, the war was a salvation and a liberation of the people from the corrupt and reactionary government. On the other hand, the nationalists and the West perceived it as the loss of China to communism and the loss of a potential counterbalance against the Soviet Union. This sentiment grew stronger when China entered the Korean War on the side of Communist North Korea against the UN forces. Whether liberation or loss, the repercussions of the 4 years of Chinese Civil War would be felt for decades to come.